I want to again thank Dr. Levy. Great. Anat. Our daughter-in-law is named Anat. Okay, wonderful. Sounds like you can all hear me. Unfortunately, I can't seem to put on the slides at the same time as the web camera. So you won't be able to see me wearing a blue tie and a white shirt in honor of Israel, and I even have an Israeli flag to the right of me. But anyway, thank you again for joining us, and again, Shalom and Yom Tov. I'm Jay Liebowitz. I'm actually calling speaking with you from Washington, D.C., and again, I want to thank Dr. Levy for inviting me to speak today. And what I'd like to do is, again, to spend about 45 minutes for those who just joined us, talking about success and failure factors relating to knowledge management. And then I have received from Dr. Levy a number of questions from you all in advance, and I'll answer those, and then I'll be happy to answer any other questions or comments, and we'll close by 5:30 in the evening your time. So let me first start out with a little story where there's a young fellow, and he goes and sees Solomon, the wise sage, and he asked Solomon, "How did you become so wise?" Oh, I can work the slide, so I'm still on the first slide, so hold on one second. So he said, "How did you become so wise?" And he said, "Well, that's from making good decisions." And he said, "Well, how do you make good decisions?" He says, "Well, that's from experience." And, "Well, how do you gain experience?" "Well, it's from making bad decisions." So I've always felt that you learn a lot from kind of the bittersweet stories, aside from, the successes. So the theme of the talk this afternoon is really to look at successes and failures of KM. And it's based also partly on my new book, which was published in July with that same title. And I know Dr. Levy has information on it, and it might be of interest to you all. It came out in July by Morgan Kaufman and Elsevier. Okay, so let me move ahead. And I'm assuming this is being recorded. So as I mentioned, I had the great opportunity to go with our congregation to Israel over the summer. So you could see me, my wife, at the wall, and we just had a wonderful time. We toured throughout most of Israel, and again, I was very proud to see, how we have accomplished so much in such a short period of time. And I also had the occasion to see Dr. Levy while I was in Jerusalem, and her husband, and we had a nice dinner as well. So let me move on. And Charles Dickens had this quote from A Tale of Two Cities, and it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first present some insights on success, failure factors that are associated with knowledge management. Then I'm going to present two case studies relating to knowledge management, and one that worked well, so kind of the best of times, and one that did not work so well, perhaps, the worst of times. And then I will focus on communities of practice, which still seem to be the most frequently used KM application today. And then finally, I will give you my top 10 lessons learned on knowledge management. Well, when we look at knowledge management implementation, many people still focus on the technology component. And we all know that the process and the people, the cultural aspects are even more important. And this is shown by the quote on the screen by Richard Venn. And he talks about the importance of having a good process. And even when I worked at NASA, I was the first knowledge management officer at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center outside of Washington, D.C. And NASA has a lessons learned process that is embedded into their daily working lives. So each project team, no matter which project you're working on, has to go ahead and capture lessons learned relating to that project, and they have to apply those, and they're asked about that during each of the various reviews, going through project inception through design, development, and implementation. And so many organizations, including, for example, the United States Agency for International Development, which is called USAID. I just saw Stacy Young, who is their kind of chief knowledge officer, their senior learning advisor, and they even have learning advisors and a learning process that is being used throughout the world through their USAID colleagues. If you look at, in terms of process, there are people like Clyde Holsapple. Clyde is a professor at the University of Kentucky, and he's actually about getting ready to retire. He has a chapter in my new book, and he also is an editor of the Handbook of Knowledge Management. There were several volumes which you might have seen some years ago. And he discusses what he calls this pair combination of KM process and outcome. So the P stands for productivity, the A stands for agility, the I stands for innovation, and the R stands for reputation. So what he found in his research is that through the KM process, superiority along any one or several of the pair dimensions can be regarded as a kind of knowledge management success. And all else being equal, he found that it translates into a higher competitive standing for the organization. Well, let me give you a little backdrop on kind of on KM and what's happening, and then I'll talk about the two case studies that I was involved in, one being successful and one being not so successful. So if you look at the research, still today, one of the most comprehensive studies on KM research methodologies dates back from 2011. And essentially, they found that out of 22,000 references with about 2,800 source publications, the KM papers that were published up to that time, about 2/3 of them did not have any formal research methodology or any identifiable research method at all. So we in the academic community for knowledge management, we still have some work to do. Now, there was a paper that was published a little later, actually last year in October of 2015, and it was called Trends in Research Methodological Procedures Used in KM Studies. It actually appeared in the African Journal of Library Architecture and Information Sciences. And they studied 303 articles that were published between 2009 and 2013 in the Journal of Knowledge Management, which, as you know, is our oldest journal of KM. I think it was launched around 1986. And they found that surveys, case studies, and content analysis were the most favored research techniques. Well, let me show you a couple of trends. So on this figure, this is showing, if you put in, these are Google searches since 2004. And if you put in the term knowledge management, you see over time kind of a downward trend in knowledge management searches. And this is coming from Vincent Rouviere's work, who also had a chapter in my book, but he is with the Institute for Knowledge Management at Bangkok University in Thailand. Now, if you look at the number of academic publications with knowledge management, oh, that's weird. You can't see the graph in here. Well, sorry about that. I don't know why the graph didn't appear, but Dr. Levy, you can feel free to forward the slides, and if you don't have this particular slide with the graph, just let me know. Maybe the line is too light in here. Anyway, if you do look at the number of academic publications with knowledge management as a keyword, you would see a peak around 2011. And then there's a downward trend through 2014. So I was also very curious about how this translates into KM jobs with this kind of downward trend. So I took a look at two major job search sites in the US. And for the first 6 months of this year, I was curious to see how many KM jobs were posted in the US. So on Indeed, which is a major job search engine here, there were over 4,000 KM jobs in the first 6 months of 2016, mainly US based. And if you looked at Monster as a job search engine, there were over 1,000 US based jobs. And so even though there might seem to be a downward trend in terms of knowledge management searches and academic publications, you're still seeing many people who are advertising for KM positions. So that's very, very good. I also was very interested in knowing, maybe why KM might be having some kind of difficulties. So Vincent Rouviere, with collaboration with his co-authors, had interviewed 34 experts worldwide, and they found that there were about 111 reasons why knowledge management may have difficulties. And these could then be grouped into the 7 categories that you see shown here. They're not prioritized in order, with the exception of culture. And so culture was cited as the #1 reason. And we'll get to that in a few minutes when I talk about the cases. But you could see some of the other related kind of clustered categories where you have to really be concerned if you want to have a successful KM program. And I see from Dr. Levy that she will provide the slides, and we'll share them with everyone after the meeting. Okay, thanks, Maria. Okay, so with that as a background, I want to turn your attention to 2 knowledge management related case studies that I had some involvement. And being from the Washington, D.C. area, I'm going to focus on 2 government applications, although you could see parallels between private, industry and even not-for-profit types of cases, as well. So the first one, which is kind of the successful one, is NASA. And the failed one, or the bittersweet case, is from the Federal Communications Commission, called the FCC, based in Washington. So let me first start with NASA, and then I'll get into the FCC case. Ed Hoffman is the Chief Knowledge Officer at NASA. Actually, he was appointed in 2012, and he just retired in May. But under his direction, and even before Ed became the Chief Knowledge Officer, there are 10 NASA centers. And but under his direction, NASA formed this Knowledge Services Strategic Framework. And what you can see is that it's based on the left side, looking at people, kind of the personalization approaches, and the right side looking at systems. So there's an interplay between the people and the systems. So on the people side, you see the focus looking at networks and communities of practice and a culture, developing a culture of knowledge sharing. And on the right side, on the systems approach, you see having access to various information and access to lessons learned, as we talked about a few minutes ago, and best practices. So let me show you a quote from Dr. Hoffman. And the approach that NASA used, because there were 10 NASA centers across the United States, he thought it was best to have a federated approach where, since each NASA center has its own requirements in kind of culture, the federated model seemed to fit the best. So even though NASA does push for a one NASA approach across all 10 NASA centers, each particular center has its own dynamics, its own culture, and so a federated approach was used. So I'm going to show you this knowledge map, and that's essentially what they called it at NASA. And what you can see might not be very clear, but it's showing you various knowledge management applications that are being used at each center. And there's a pretty wide sample of KM-related activities across the centers. And they range from case studies to face-to-face knowledge sessions, to online tools, to knowledge networks, to lessons learned processes, and to taxonomy and search engines. So I was the first knowledge management officer at NASA Goddard Space Center, which is located over here, and again in the Washington, D.C. area. And you could see that we have used all of those approaches. At NASA, they also have a very active network of NASA engineering communities of practice. And they are situated under the Office of the Chief Engineer. The key with these online communities are that you have to be able to tie the discussions to actual practice. And so Galit had sent a note here saying that you understand that Jive is used as a platform. So it really depends on the particular NASA center. And there isn't a uniform set of tools that are necessarily used. I helped create the knowledge management strategy for NASA Langley Research Center last year. And so I believe they were using Jive, but again, it really depends on the particular NASA center. Okay, so let me just move on. So since we're talking about public sector organizations, I just wanted to show you an article that appeared from the IRM, the Information Resource Management Journal, and they wanted to see how is knowledge sharing effective? And again, they looked at mainly public sector managers. And you could see on the screen the main criteria. So to have an open leadership climate, to have a capacity to learn from failure. When I was the knowledge management officer at NASA Goddard, I wanted to have a failure award. And they said, well, who would want to receive an award for failing? But I wanted to recognize people for sharing the bittersweet stories, and the value of the award would be determined by the knowledge recipient and the knowledge that he or she received, so that they didn't go down the wrong path. So at that time, they didn't call it a failure award. They called it, as a euphemism, a significant learning award, which was even better. So you could see some of the other criteria: good information quality, satisfaction with the change processes, having a performance orientation, and having a vision for change. Okay, well, just to wrap up the NASA story, what they did not too long ago was they had a brainstorming session among all of their knowledge management officers throughout NASA. And based on the brainstorming session, they developed what they considered to be their vision for KM looking out to 2020. And you could see within kind of the clouds some of the key elements that are so important. So you see culture, recognition, there's mentoring, process, social networking, and other KM-related events with some do's and don'ts. So they had a very thoughtful approach to doing knowledge management. So in my estimation, I would say that NASA has been successful in being able to infuse knowledge management within their project management, risk management, systems engineering practices throughout all of the agency. Okay, so that to me was a pretty good case. Now, let me mention the second case study dealing with the Federal Communications Commission, and that's another story. This wasn't quite as successful, and I was involved in both the NASA example as well as this FCC example. So some of you may not be familiar with the FCC in the United States. It's an independent U.S. government agency, and it's led by a chairman and commissioners. And the FCC regulates interstate and international communications by radio, TV, wire, satellite, cable, in all the 50 states, DC, and the U.S. territories. So what happened was I was working as the IEEE Executive Fellow, reporting to the Chief Technology Officer at the FCC. And my project was to conduct a knowledge audit and develop a knowledge management strategy for the FCC. Just as background, most of those in the Federal Communications Commission were engineers, lawyers, scientists, and technologists by background. So what you're going to see in the next few slides are some highlights based on the knowledge audit study, which reflected around a people, process, and technology focus. And so let me just highlight a few points relating to the knowledge audit and explain what we did. So it was very apparent we had an extremely high response rate. It was about 70%, and which was very high. And it was shown that that there was a need to kind of standardize existing knowledge in the form of procedures and protocols. There was a great need to capture what I call decision rationale, and that is understanding the pros and cons and the issues involved when for a particular decision. And if those could be captured in some way, they could then be used when a new problem, which is analogous to a previous one, is faced. Maybe they could use that a solution as a base or adapt from it. However, for legal reasons, per discovery, you may not want to, have everything captured. But anyway, there seemed to be a great interest in, trying to provide ways to capture lessons learned. They did use some KM approaches. So they had cross-functional teaming. They had some online communities of practice, and they used the intranet, and they, had some other related types of sharing mechanisms. They did believe, as I mentioned, that the key knowledge loss would be the knowledge of non-published considerations behind the decisions. And they did feel that the main inhibitors to knowledge management, like what you see at most organizations, dealt with time pressures and a high turnover of personnel, and not, sufficient resources and the usual turf protection. There was little to no organizational buy-in about KM among staff and management at that time, and no formal training programs. Okay, so it was very clear from the audit that, as well as follow-on interviews, that there were symptoms that suggested a need for knowledge management at the FCC. And some of those symptoms are shown on the screen. And you can appreciate this because right now we are going through a new administration, which you know plenty about, here in the US, and new senior executives are being hired. And typically, sometimes there's little handoffs that are being made. So that could lead to some knowledge loss, if you will, and continuity within the organization. And aside from that, not only people who have valuable expertise might be leaving, or even, aside from having a new administration, they, might be retiring. The training and development budget really needed to be increased to augment further development of human capital there. So what we did is we developed the KM strategy looking at these four main knowledge management goals. And they were focused around people, process, and technology issues. So based on these goals, and you could see them on the screen, I won't read those to you, but we were able to develop a knowledge management strategy and an implementation plan, which was created. And this was then put together as part of an internal FCC publication, which was sent throughout all members of the FCC. Well, there were some very interesting cultural considerations that were noted. So in fact, with the new administration coming into the FCC at that particular time that I was there was a little too much turmoil, and the key advocates were also leaving the FCC. Whoops. Let me go back here. So we knew that this KM strategy should not be driven by the chief technology officer. So we went ahead and we engaged the managing director, who saw value in KM, who was like the COO, if you will, at the FCC. So that was, I think, advantageous. However, both the managing director and the CTO ended up leaving with the new administration. There was also a trust but verify approach. Many people in the FCC were attorneys and were skeptics. Although, to be frank, I spoke about a month ago at the Knowledge Management and Law Conference in New York. Many of the law firms in the US and elsewhere have a chief knowledge officer. So the bottom line, though, is that this is kind of a bittersweet story because we weren't able to get much traction in applying knowledge management at that time. However, as an epilogue, recently I heard from one of the chief engineers at the FCC, and he said that they're starting to do now what was recommended by our KM strategy. And even the new CIO, Chief Information Officer, David Bray, who is at the FCC, he also has a knowledge management background. So who knows, maybe this bittersweet story will turn into a successful one. All right, so those are the two stories. And now I would like to switch gears and talk about communities of practice, because whether you look at the NASA case or any best practice knowledge management report from, for example, the APQC and others, communities of practice, COPs, are a key part of a KM strategy. So let me talk a little about COPs in terms of success and failure factors, and then I'll conclude with my top 10 lessons learned in knowledge management. And I'm watching the time, and so we're on schedule. My plan is to make sure we're finished with my talk by 5 p.m. your time, and then I'll have a half hour to address the questions that were sent in ahead of time, as well as any other questions and comments you all might have. Well, I just wanted to show you at some companies like IBM, their Global Business Solutions group, and I know that you have a very active group at IBM, I think at Haifa, if I recall correctly, maybe Rehovot. But anyway, they put together this kind of quadrant in order to demonstrate value for their knowledge sharing efforts. So essentially, the idea is you want to move toward the top right-hand quadrant, looking at productivity. So communities of practice certainly fit under the bottom two quadrants, knowledge sharing and collaboration. But what you really want is to improve the outcomes in the organization, right? So, so many organizations, are looking for ways to not only look at system and output measures, but you really want outcome measures, okay? So going back to communities of practice, there was a nice study done by Probst and Barzillo, and they looked at 57 communities of practice from major European and U.S. companies, and they determined from that study what were the COP success factors and those kind of failure factors. On the success side, they found that it was most important to link to strategic objectives, to also translate the discussions in the COP into practice. I actually did some work for a major confectionery company, a chocolate company in the US, and they had the same problem where even though they used online communities, the people, the employees, couldn't translate the discussions into their work environment. So therefore, the COPs fell into disuse. So you want to also make sure that the COPs are energized through external expertise or polling, and you want to have a very active community leader. You also don't want to be siloed, so you want to promote access to other intra and inter-organizational networks, and you want to be able to show value, whether quantitatively or qualitatively, of the COPs. Okay, so in their study, they also looked at why COPs may fail, and I thought I would mention those to you, and you could see those on the screen. Lack of a core group, low level of one-to-one interaction between members, a reluctance to learn, and this whole, issue of kind of practice intangibility where you can't relate the discussions to your own work environment. So it's very important that, you think about impact and what COPs can offer even ahead of time. So this is kind of interesting. You can't just create a community of practice in an ad hoc, willy-nilly way. You really should have some purposeful thought beforehand. So, in fact, these are some questions that Cisco uses before starting a community of practice. And you could see those listed. I won't read those out for you, but some of the more interesting ones are that they require the COP leaders to have a 90-day, a 3-month content pipeline ahead of time to make sure that the community of practice can actively be launched and be energized, in the way that it should. And on the last bullet, KPIs or key performance indicators, again, you want to make sure that you are in alignment with your strategic and business goals. Well, what's also important is that you have a very good community leader. And what does that mean? It means someone who has passion, genuine passion, has respect from the community members, with his or her peers, is open-minded, is a good collaborator, and even, a good organizer and facilitator. So I found this particular study. This was in the UK, in England, and they looked at how much time it takes to do the job of a community facilitator or a leader. And on average, it takes about 6.3 hours per week, where the largest amounts of time, as you can see, were spent on introducing content, moderating, and building growth of the COP. So 6 hours a week on average is, fairly sizable. It actually fits within the 10 to 20% range that NASA has found in their experience in terms of needing the community facilitators' time. And this is actually based, the sample was also looking at government organizations. Well, it's also important for organizations to assess the value of their COPs. And Ellie has a question, and I'll come right back to it. You might know about Richard McDermott and Etienne Wenger. They've done a lot of work looking at communities of practice. And these are some of the questions that they use in order to look at influence, leverage, value, and outcomes. So, what has the overall value of the community been to you and your team? What was the value of that for you as an individual? Can you estimate the value of that knowledge to your business unit in cost savings, reduced cycle time, increased quality of decision making? What percentage of that value came directly from the community? So again, what they're trying to do, and this might relate to your question. It's so important that even aside from COPs, the KM strategy must be in alignment with the organizational, strategic, and business goals. So if you don't, from research, and I'll mention this coming up shortly, there are two main reasons why knowledge management efforts fail. The first is that you don't have the alignment of the KM strategy with your overarching organizational strategy. So there's a disconnect there. And then the other reason is that you just might have a poorly designed knowledge management implementation plan. So in terms of connecting COP activity to business outcomes, that's why you really need to look at your key performance indicators, going back to the core competencies of your organization. And then COPs can be formed in a number of different ways. They could be very structured, which are kind of more work team oriented. They could be more informal, right? They could also be communities of interest instead of communities of practice, where communities of interest may not necessarily be made up of community members who are practitioners in that area. They just have a general interest. So again, you need to have that connection. And Dr. Levy talks about in her comment here that in social media environments, we find that the job of a channel manager is 50 to 100%, which is even higher than the statistics I'm giving. Okay, so let me now finish up with kind of my top 10, and maybe they're not necessarily in order, but my 10 rules of the road. And I'll use a desert motif so that an organization's creativity and innovation won't dry up, so to speak. Okay, so the first is that, and I just kind of mentioned this, is you need to have a senior champion and align your KM strategy with your organizational strategies, goals, and objectives. And as I mentioned, this is probably the number one reason why KM strategies have failed, at least according to the research. And because then you can't really assess the value of the KM efforts as it relates back to the key performance indicators and the strategic goals of the organization. So if you don't have that alignment, you may be heading for a collision, as shown by this car on the screen. Number 2, develop a well-designed knowledge management develop a well-designed KM implementation plan, looking at people, process, and technology. So as I mentioned previously too, the other reason why knowledge management efforts fail is that they have a poorly designed KM implementation plan. So you really need to have a very well-conceived KM strategic roadmap and resulting implementation plan. When I was at NASA Goddard as their knowledge management officer, we had a very aggressive 2-year knowledge management plan. In the first year, we really focused on education, creating also KM awareness at all levels in the organization, developing the technology infrastructure for knowledge sharing, and having quick win pilots and metrics. Then in the second year, we went ahead and we developed the organizational infrastructure to support knowledge management. We embedded KM processes into the daily working lives of the employees. We enhanced the recognition and reward system to promote knowledge sharing behaviors. And then we expanded the KM pilots into full-fledged KM projects. So many technical organizations like NASA and others, for example, Fluor, which is an engineering company in the US, they have virtual technical networks, and they have over 50 communities of practice with more than 1,000 SME, subject matter experts, engaged with over 10,000 searches and queries per day. Okay, so I just wanted to mention those two. Number 3, as shown, you want to develop a formal knowledge retention strategy. And my view is you want to start from day one of the employee's lifespan with the organization. So you really need a knowledge retention SOP, standard operating procedure. And you want to apply it from the beginning of the employee's tenure with the organization, because later on, the knowledge engineering paradox will set in, which means the more expert you become, the more compiled your knowledge and the harder it is to elicit that knowledge. And the research also shows that exit interviews don't work well. The Institute for Corporate Productivity in the U.S., I4CP, I think is the name, I4CP. They did a knowledge retention study of 426 companies, and they showed that 77% didn't have a formal knowledge retention strategy. To me, knowledge retention should be part of your overarching knowledge management and human capital strategy. Okay, number 4, you should incorporate KM. It doesn't have to be a standalone program. If you have the funding, that's fine, but you could also incorporate it within existing programs in your organization. And it could be, for example, integrated within existing efforts relating to human capital strategy, or if you have a succession planning effort, or a strategic planning effort, or quality management. In the US, the Food and Drug Administration, they put KM within their quality management and strategic planning initiatives. The Georgia Department of Transportation incorporates KM within their succession planning and workforce development. The Annie E. Casey Foundation, which is the 12th largest foundation in the US, incorporates KM within their strategy. Exelon Constellation, which is a major energy company, incorporates it within their human resources area. And major, Fortune 500 companies also incorporate KM within their global R&D and technology and innovation divisions. So again, it really depends on where there is the best fit for KM, where you can get the most traction. Okay, number 5, be very thoughtful in your approach. So I do work in these areas. I try to develop academic approaches, and instruments, validated instruments, and use social network analysis to map knowledge flows and gaps. So again, you want to, be very thoughtful in the way you approach knowledge management. Number 6, you again want to align your KM approaches to fit your organizational culture. And so at NASA, for example, most of the people there, if you did a Myers-Briggs type indicator test, they would be ISTJ types. They were kind of a little bit introverted. They preferred systems approaches. So we erred on having more systems collection-oriented approaches, and also brought in personalization, the connection approaches. So Yakir Franklin was saying that, this is probably one of the most important, if not the most important. And so again, you have to know, and as I mentioned, these aren't in any particular order, although certainly the first 2 I gave you, making sure you have alignment of your KM strategy is so important. But culture is also extremely important. And I'll talk about that in some of the questions that were sent to me yesterday. Okay, number 7, make sure you celebrate the successes and bring in the bittersweet stories. So you want to get people on board. So at NASA, for example, they knew that the engineers and the project management folks and the technologists typically worked in teams, in team-based approaches. They ended up being the primary advocates, whereas some of the scientists, even though they work in teams, there was a little more of a power struggle because, as a scientist, you want to be, who's going to be the first author. So there's a little more power play there than dealing with some of the engineers and technologists. So again, bring in the successes first, and then bring in the bittersweet stories. Okay, number 8, you want to develop KM metrics. Again, you want to make sure that you look at outcome measures. So system and output measures are fine, but you want to know, how is KM generating new products or services? How is it improving worker productivity? How is it reducing in-cycle time? So again, you want to look at outcomes. So serious anecdotal evidence is fine, but it's also helpful to tie KM to outcomes. Okay, number 9, don't force fit technology to requirements. So the old adage, if the only tool you know is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So again, you want to be very thoughtful in your approaches. And to me, knowledge management is just one part of your strategic intelligence. Analytics, intuition, relationship building, all of these contribute to improving the strategic decision making in the organization. These are some personal favorites, just joking. And so let me conclude with just a few more slides, and I see I have 5 minutes left before I address the questions. So these are the knowledge sharing tenets that I try to live by. You really want, most people from the research, people want to be recognized and not so much rewarded. They're looking for intrinsic motivation. And so, for example, one company published, it was called the Best Newsletter, KNEWS, and in it, they indicated whose lessons learned was accessed the most, and then how did those people apply that knowledge? And they recognized, the contributor of that particular lesson. So organizations are starting to incorporate, but not many, learning and knowledge sharing competencies into their recognition reward structure. And I think that's so important. You also want to create a safe environment to discuss things that worked and those that didn't. And so again, not everything goes according to plan. You hope for the best, but again, we should be able to learn from those situations. So let me move on. So I'm going to cite just 2 resources that might be useful for you. Last year, I worked on a project with a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. And this was funded through the National Academy of Sciences in the US, their Transportation Research Board. And what we were asked to do is to develop a guide for senior executives of state departments of transportation. So we put together over a year, it took, with panels, reviews. This is, there's a PDF of this, and there's also a web version as well. So this might be very useful, even though the vignettes deal with transportation. It gives you a general feeling, going through the steps in developing a knowledge management strategy and implementation plan. Okay, and then finally, and I have 2 minutes to spare, this is the book that I mentioned. We had many of the leaders throughout the world provide some of their insights. I wish we could have had more folks involved, but I think it would give you some very interesting background on what's happening throughout the world in terms of success and failure factors, in terms of the research and the actual practice. For example, in Hong Kong, there's a chapter by Eric Tsui where he has worked on over 200 knowledge management projects and provides some of his insights. So with that, I'm going to say Toda Rabah. on the lecture part. And I know that Dr. Levy had sent me, and I see some of the people are on the line, about 5 or 6 questions in advance. So what I can do is address those questions first, and then I can, open it up for any other questions or comments. Is that okay, Mariah? I'm going to go ahead and work it that way. So I see that Eli is on the call, and I believe Eli is a former CKO. He's with the Negev Nuclear Research Center, and he asked, could you please recommend a strategy for implementation of big data-based knowledge management in organizations? And Eli, it's interesting, with your work at the Negev Nuclear Research Center, I actually spoke about 3 weeks ago in Vienna at the International Energy Agency's Nuclear Knowledge Management Conference. It was their 3rd Nuclear Knowledge Management Conference, and it was very, very timely. And certainly in the nuclear energy field, KM is well recognized as being needed and being very important. So to address your question, when I think of big data-based KM, I really think of it in terms of strategic intelligence, of which there are 3 components. There's knowledge management. If you had a Venn diagram, so you had knowledge management, you have competitive intelligence, and you have business intelligence. And the intersection would be what I would consider strategic intelligence. How do you improve the strategic decision-making of the organization? And actually, next semester, I'm teaching a course on strategic intelligence. So KM, you know what that is. The BI, business intelligence, to me, that would be considered part of the big data and analytics and intelligence system approaches. And CI would be competitive intelligence. So what do you learn from your competitors? So it's so important that you develop a framework looking at these 3 areas. And actually, Scott Erickson, who's a professor at Ithaca, he's done a lot of work looking at intellectual capital. He wrote a nice paper, and it was called Big Data and Knowledge Management, Establishing a Conceptual Framework. And you can get it online at the European Journal for Knowledge Management, EJKM website. I think it was published in 2014. And he talks about organizations, maybe like yours, that have a high knowledge management and a high competitive intelligence. He calls them SPF 45s. And the idea is that the big data would fit right into these industries as a valuable contributor. And it also would apply to companies like pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, communications, and media. So, so that might be of interest to you. Also, if you look at the November-December 2016 issue, which was just published, of Informs Analytics, I wrote a piece on developing a business intelligence analytics strategy for organizations. And so that I then used the Delphi survey to kind of vet that framework. And so you really have to consider kind of these 3 areas. It's hard to tell you one particular strategy, but they should cover these 3 areas. And even when we look at KM and experiential learning, I'm doing work now looking at intuition-based decision-making and how does it replace or complement analytics. And there have been recent studies, for example, KPMG in October 31 of this year, they published a report that indicated that CEOs don't trust their analytics because of internal data quality. And There was another study done at the University of Cambridge back in September that was published that showed that financial traders actually those who use their gut feelings, so these are hedge fund traders, outperform those who don't. So when you look at this whole area of big data and KM, you should not forget about the use of intuition. And I'm actually conducting a number of experiments with behavioral psychologists. And actually in Israel in 2012, at Tel Aviv University, I think the School of Psychology, there were two faculty members who did a study that showed that 90% of the executives in their study who relied on intuition fared better than those who didn't, who relied strictly on a data-driven approach. And I think you could look up that information in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences Journal. So all I'm saying is you have to consider kind of the overarching framework, looking at KM, and BI. Okay, let me move on to the next question. This is from Mrs. Al Parlov, who is a KM consultant at ROM Knowledgeware, Dr. Levy's company. And she asked, based on your experience and knowledge, please share how internal collaboration could improve project team knowledge sharing in pharmaceutical companies. So I'll give you a couple of thoughts on this. First of all, the pharmaceuticals, the pharmas, in a way, they're kind of like NASA in terms of, being scientific and technically focused. And I see a lot of organizations in that type of sector using project team wikis for enabling knowledge sharing among their project teams. I saw this at NASA too. Project team wikis were a great way for sharing ideas and documents and different thoughts relating to the particular project. Now, as related to the pharma industry, there's actually a book by Elizabeth Goodman and John Riddle that's called Knowledge Management in the Pharma Industry, and it was published in 2014. The publisher is Gower, Gower, and they talk about 5 ways that knowledge management is helping pharmas meet their challenges. So let me just highlight what they say. So the first is that KM is helping pharmaceuticals through facilitating collaboration between the different players in the landscape. And this is sometimes referred to as open innovation, both in how people interact with each other and in how the content is managed between them. So for example, in the book, one of the interviewees works mainly with small biotech startups and with a virtual network of associates and experts from academia, healthcare, and pharmaceutical companies. And her role is broadly that of a facilitator to get a project started from the interpretation of the initial ideas, putting the processes in place for making it a reality. So facilitating collaboration is one approach. The second is to explore different ways in which technology can be used to support the generation of new knowledge from big data. So for example, there was one case where it involved the provision of technology tools to do data mining with a newsletter and a Twitter-like newsfeed of all the latest developments in key therapeutic areas. So by leveraging the latest text mining technology, a broad coverage could be provided at a fraction of the cost of traditional competitive intelligence tools. And then the other 3 ways that KM can help pharma meet the challenges is to cultivate and develop knowledge-sharing behaviors as core competencies within the organization. 4th, to continue to embed proven methodologies such as communities of practice and before, during, and after action reviews, and finding new ways to engage with and learn from patients. In fact, I just read an interesting study. I told to our older son, who's a physician at Johns Hopkins, it was a study done looking at opinion mining of patient reviews, and it's more in the medical hospital area, but they found that the three most important factors that influenced either success or kind of failure in terms of the physician, in terms of the patient's impression of the physician, dealt with listening, communications, kind of the bedside manner, and of course having the right diagnosis. Okay, so let me move on to the next question. This is from Mr. Avi Sharon, who's a former CKO at Amdocs, a high-tech company. And the questions are two questions, and then there are two more questions after that, and then we'll see what else you all might have. So the first is, taking into account that organizations are very systems, have there been any consistent factors that were proven to be key factors for KM initiative success? And the second related question is, having achieved success in launching a KM initiative, what is essential to keep the success sustainable in the long run? So let me mention the first question related to factors for KM initiative success. And we've talked about some of them already. And also in the American Productivity Quality Center, APQC, KM benchmarking studies. This is a very active group headed by Carla Odell. In April of every year, they have their KM major conference in Houston. So some of the critical success factors are leadership, right, to have support in aligning KM strategy, culture, which has been highlighted by some of you all, as well as some of the comments that I've made, and that's looking at process and organizational climate and the recognition reward structure. Okay, governance, so having the right structure, roles, and responsibilities, the IT infrastructure, and also measurement. So these are some of the key success factors. And what's even a more interesting question, I think, is, once you have achieved success in launching a KM initiative, what can you do to keep it sustainable? So I did a little bit of research because I had my own ideas, but there was a very nice article that was kind of a blog by Nick Milton. Nick Milton is very good in KM. He's from England, from the UK. He actually wrote a blog entry on July 9, 2015 on how to sustain knowledge management. And he talks about that great KM programs often fail when they're not treated as culture change programs or not given the required time to make the change. So he mentions a number of sustained successes in KM, like Shell, Mars, IBM, Siemens, Buckman Labs, Fluor, Schlumberger, many more, and many in the military sector. But the main difference is that to be sustained over a period of many years, KM has to become embedded. So if an organization really wants KM to be sustained, then it really needs to be part of the normal business process. It needs to be planted out into the business. It has to be listed together with other project deliverables. It needs to be defined as part of minimum conditions of satisfaction for management. It has to affect salaries and promotions. And there should be a KM policy along with other company policies. And this should all be part of the strategic objectives. So advice to a knowledge manager who wants to sustain KM, might be the following. Once you've demonstrated some value from KM, you don't want to rest on your laurels. You need to go to senior management. You need to show them what you've delivered. You want to sell them on the benefits and work with them to embed KM deep, into the normal fabric of the organization. So Nick Milton talks about these specific points to sustain KM. You want to maybe write a KM policy and rank it alongside the other organizational policies. You want to change the project requirements to include KM. You want to change the minimum conditions of satisfaction for project delivery to include effective lessons identification. You want to change the rules for project sanctions. So maybe a project gets no money if there isn't any learning before doing. You want to have the right job descriptions throughout the company to account for stewardship of the company's knowledge base. And you want to change the HR appraisal mechanism to change the incentive scheme to recognize and reward collaboration in learning and knowledge sharing proficiencies. So again, these are in terms of how to sustain KM within your organization. Okay, 2 more questions, and then I'll open it up to the floor. The next question was from Mrs. Adat Chen-Monker, who's the CKO at the Israeli Aircraft Industries. And her question deals with engineering knowledge is both what and how. So can you recommend proven methods for capturing the tacit knowledge? And thanks, Moria, for posting that question. So here are some ideas. Of course, a number, even when I was the knowledge management officer at NASA Goddard, I wrote a book titled Knowledge Retention, Strategies and Solutions by Taylor and Francis. And to me, organizations are using a variety of techniques to kind of capture the how-to knowledge. And they include before, during, and after action reviews, capturing lessons learned. Sandia National Labs has a knowledge preservation project where they have video nuggets that are using searchable software, similar to what CNN uses. So video nuggets of experts dealing with weapon design and testing, and you can easily access particular clips of interest to you within a certain number of keywords. At NASA, we also had do's and don'ts tutorials by key experts in the field, and you can use different knowledge retention tools. So, for example, there are tools like CMAPS that are based on concept maps. It's through the University of West Florida, and I've used that, and it kind of helps you develop kind of the key attributes relating to a particular subject matter, domain knowledge. But the key is you really need a knowledge retention formal strategy as part of your overarching knowledge management strategy. And again, it should really start from the employee's first day with the organization. So there should be some knowledge retention SOP, standard operating procedure. If you want to look at additional references relating to knowledge retention, aside from my book, the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, is well recognized in their knowledge retention efforts. And APQC in Houston has had a number of knowledge retention studies over the years, benchmarking studies, and that might help you as well. Okay, finally, we'll get to Dr. Levy's question about reaching 2017. What are the new trends of knowledge management we're expected to see? So actually, I spoke at the Knowledge Management World Conference last month related to this topic. And there are a number of trends that we see in the near term. The first is that you're going to see in this kind of this era of big data, we're going to see a coupling of knowledge management with big data analytics and AI, including deep learning through neural nets, data-driven approaches. So this whole era of what IBM calls the cognitive computing era, I think we're going to continue, if we want KM to really leverage, again, to take into account strategic intelligence, how do you improve the strategic decision-making capabilities of the organization? KM will have to somehow be woven with some of the data analytics and the AI work, and that's already being done. We see this through text mining and data mining. We see this through the use of intelligent agents and nobots. So some of that is already being done. We'll also see KM in terms of experiential learning. We're going to intuition-based decision-making. So as I mentioned, I'm doing work on intuition-based executive decision-making, and KM can really be used as a great lever, because what we have found is for intuition, it's really, part of it is based on experiential learning, and that's what KM is. And so if we could, apply some of the KM work to enhance decision-making as related to intuition and analytics, I think that will also be important in the years ahead. Another trend is that we're going to continue to see niche applications for KM. As I mentioned last month, I spoke at the KM and Law Conference in New York. There were about 200 people there from most of the major law firms. So we're seeing KM, even though they kind of have a little different definition of KM, but we're seeing KM being used in niche areas. Healthcare is going to continue to be important, not only for knowledge management, but for healthcare analytics. We're doing a lot of work with healthcare companies, with my university, and they're just crying out for healthcare analytics professionals. Okay, and then another key trend that will continue is the idea of social. So social is still the name of the game. So we're going to continue to look at connections and mobile technologies and really provide ways to increase connections coupled with, the collection approaches. So those are some of my thoughts based on the questions that have come in. And we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm happy to take any other questions. I see there are some listed. Let's see, Esther, and speaking of law firms, what methods would you recommend for encouraging employees, lawyers, to contribute content to KM systems and to use KM resources? So it turns out that the firms that have been most successful in KM, in fact, there's another conference coming up by the ARC Group in February in New York City, I believe, for KM and law and libraries. So Esther, you might take a look at that. And there's a fellow who's actually from Israel originally. I think he's the chief knowledge officer at White & Case. And so they've been very successful. His name is, I'm not sure if it's, I think it's O-Z is his, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, his first name. But the firms that have been most successful in incorporating knowledge management have provided ways to count it toward their workload. So even though you may not have certain billable hours for doing KM work in law firms. It might be thought of as overhead. The better law firms have been able to develop a pool based on your knowledge management contributions. And then that particular pool could be applied toward certain incentives for you and rewards as a lawyer. So I would refer you, I actually had published a paper called Knowledge Management in Law Firms, looking at cultural considerations, and it was published in the Legal Information Management Journal by Springer. I think it was 2012. And that might provide you with some very interesting insights. Yes, and Esther has mentioned Oz as Ben Amram as a key individual. So I'll type in, you can take a look. There's an article called KM in Law, Cultural Considerations, and this was by my co-author Zaidi and Liebowitz, and it appeared in the Legal Information Management Journal by Springer, I believe, in 2012. So, and I also have a number of quotes from, we reached out to chief knowledge officers of law firms in the US and abroad. So that might provide you with additional information. Okay, Yakir talks about you're at Amdocs, managed services globally. You're finding that despite many knowledge articles for solutions to operational and application related issues, the consumption of the knowledge to resolve incidents is low. I've gleaned your tips, thank you, but can you please advise from your experience how you have dealt with adoption of a knowledge culture when people's time constraints competing with the need to share? Okay, and this is fairly common. So this is why you really need to have senior champion support and involvement. Buckman Labs, for example, is a well-known case where Bob Buckman actually encouraged the development of their knowledge sharing system, which was called Kinetics. And this was early on. Buckman Labs is a chemical engineering company, but they're global, and they're based in, I think, Memphis, Tennessee. And in fact, their Kinetics knowledge sharing system actually won a Smithsonian Award some years ago. Anyway, he became an active user of Kinetics. And if you hadn't been accessing the knowledge sharing system, you might have received a little email or note from Bob Buckman, the CEO, to say, hey, you know, how come you're not using this, or this particular article might have been useful. So people saw that, wow, if the senior leaders are using this particular knowledge sharing system, then maybe there's some value to it, so I better use it. So having senior champion, not only financial and moral support, but active involvement is so important. I also feel that coming back to this issue of process and embedding knowledge management within the daily working lives of your people. A lot of consulting firms have done this. They also, even at NASA, when I was there, for the senior executives to get merit pay, you had to show what knowledge sharing behaviors you exhibited to get an extra boost in pay. So I think it's important as part of your recognition reward structure to provide learning and knowledge sharing proficiencies and competencies in which people can be recognized and rewarded for exhibiting those behaviors. So again, if it's built into, you know, if KM is something else that we have to do on top of a full plate, it's not going to happen. That's why you have to embed KM processes within the daily working lives. At NASA, they did it through the lessons learned process. You can look at, it's called NPG 7120.6, which is the NASA lessons learned process guidance. Whoops. NPG, sorry, 7120.6. I'm typing this out. Um, and again, that has to be again. You have to embed these activities within the daily working lives. Okay, so I hope that is useful. Let me just scroll up and see if I missed any question. There's one question. Do you see niche applications such as Slack as KM? I've seen some of that, but to be frank, I'm not as familiar with organizations that that are using that. But again, it just might be because of my own background. Okay, I'm scrolling through to see if there are other questions. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments? I know we're almost at 5:30 your time. I know it's the end of the day for you all. But any final comments or questions for me or for the group? So, Dr. Lee, if you'd be kind enough, feel free to forward the slides and the recording to all the attendees and anyone else in the Israeli KM forum. If you could also send me the link to the recording, that would be great too. And I want to wish everyone an upcoming Hanukkah Sameach. I know it's around December 24th. And want to wish you all an upcoming good Shabbos in another day. So thank you once again, and Toda Rabban, and we'll be thinking of you all.
Jay, thank you so much from all of us. Abba, we love you, and in Hebrew, אנחנו אוהבים אותך. You are one of us. Another opportunity, maybe next year. Thank you so much for your time and your effort and your knowledge.
Thanks so much. Go on. Toda Rabban.
Jay, what did you ask me to send you, please? What link?